As the board gaming hobby increases in popularity, it seems like the number of great games that are published every year increases exponentially. Obviously, I have a very limited amount of money, space, and time, so I end up doing a lot of research to try to determine which of these new releases is going to be worth picking up. Basically, I need to determine which of these games are going to be the biggest hit with my little play group, which mainly consists of myself, my wife, and one or two of our dear friends. So what I'm going to look at today are recently published games that have been the biggest hits with us. For the sake of creating this list, I need to define a couple of things, one being recent, the other being hit. So I'll somewhat arbitrarily say that by recent I mean published within the past 3 years, 2015, 2016, or 2017. And for being a hit with us, I'll say that we've played the game at least half a dozen times, so we've enjoyed the game enough to get it to the table that frequently. So let's dive into some fun games. Before I dive into the list, I'm going to take a look at 3 honorable mentions. And by honorable mentions, I mean games that have proven to be a big hit with us with the first couple of plays. And while we haven't hit those 6 plays yet to qualify for this particular list, it's highly likely that they will exceed that number. So first of all, we have Near and Far from Ryan Lockett and Red Raven Games. Near and Far is an adventure storytelling game. It's not a game that has a ton of strategic depth. It's more a game where you kind of explore the story and the narrative of the game itself. I found the storytelling to be a little bit hit and miss over our first couple of plays, but we've been enjoying the experience overall, and it's fun to explore this beautiful world and the narrative that accompanies it. Next up is The Quest for El Dorado by Rainer Knizia and published by Ravensburger. This is a race game where players need to get from one end of the map to the other. However, the main mechanism of the game is deck building, where players will start with a basic deck of weak cards. However, as they progress through the game, they're going to have to balance spending their resources on traversing the map to get to that finish line versus purchasing better cards that are going to help them travel more quickly. It's super simple, real quick, and it's been a ton of fun in our first couple of plays. And the final game in my honorable mentions is Pandemic Legacy Season 2 by Rob Davio and Matt Leacock and published by Z-Man Games. I can't show you much of this one because it's a legacy style game, which means most of the content of the game is sealed up in boxes and it's unlocked over time. So there's a lot of surprises that are yet to come. We've only gotten into the first few months so far. And as I'll mention toward the end of the actual list, Pandemic Legacy Season 1 was such a huge hit with us, and there's no reason to expect so far that Season 2 won't be the same. Alright, let's dive into the actual list now. I'm going to show the games roughly in order of the least successful with us to the biggest hits, although keeping in mind that even the least successful I'm showing because they are big hits with us. So essentially I'm just going to save the best ones till last. Okay, so first up we have The Builder's Antiquity by Frédéric Henry and Sabrina Miramon and published by Asmodee. This is a simple card-based engine building game where your little worker is going to start building some buildings, and over time you're going to increase your workforce so that you can more efficiently build buildings, and eventually you'll have this whole city of buildings that you're working toward. I love the artwork in this game. I like how the game progresses. The only thing we found to be problematic about the game is the last turn can be quite lengthy, and so we've had to sort of limit the number of actions that players can do in the final turn. But other than that, it's been a lot of fun. From there, we're going to go to a game that's actually structurally fairly similar to The Builders, and that's Villages of Valyria by Rick Holgraff and Isaias Vallejo, and published by Daily Magic Games. This is another fairly simple card-based engine building game where, just like the last game, you're trying to build up a village of buildings and bring in adventurers into your new village. The artwork in this game is what initially grabbed me. It's absolutely wonderful. And the gameplay itself is a lot of fun, with some interesting mechanisms for how players interact and can use each other's resources. I've posted a playthrough of this game where I played the solo version, and I'll link to that in the video description below. Next up is a game that I've very nearly gotten rid of a couple of times. I have to regularly cull my collection because if I want to purchase new games, I need to sell games I already have, both to get money to purchase the new games with and to create some more space on my shelves here. So on at least a couple of occasions, I've put the game up for auction only to have a last-minute change of heart and take it down immediately before posting the auction. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is this hideous box cover, which frankly is one of the worst I've seen. And secondly, even though it's a completely fictionalized theme of humans and dinosaurs roaming the earth together, I dislike the fact that one of the players plays as a team of scientists who are trying to steal baby dinos from the mummy raptor. And I just don't love that whole concept. However, it has a lot of great things going for it. It is designed by two of the greats in the game design business, Bruno Catala and Bruno Faidutti. And it bears a number of similarities to what is one of my favorite games of all time, and that is Mr. Jack and its associated games like Mr. Jack in New York. In fact, Bruno Catala is a co-author of both the Mr. Jack games and Raptor. So just as with Mr. Jack, Raptor is a strictly two-player game. It is a highly tactical, low-luck game, and it's an asymmetrical game in that each player has different types of actions they can do and is playing a slightly different game than the other player. Also similarly to Mr. Jack, one side feels more difficult to play at first. So in Mr. Jack, it feels a lot more difficult to play Jack until you really get to know the game well. And in Raptor, it feels quite difficult to play the dinos until you get to know the game. But Raptor is a game that grabs me in just the right way. I find it very fascinating. It's a fairly simple game, but it's a good little brain burner at the same time. I think it's a brilliant design, and so that's why I've kept on to it despite a couple of attempts to get rid of it. Speaking of being on the verge of getting rid of a game, I've got this monster called Star Wars Rebellion by Corey Knizia and published by Fantasy Flight Games. This thing is a beast, but it's a wonderful, lovable beast. This is the Star Wars universe in board game form in all its great, extravagant glory. The reason I've pondered whether I want to hold on to the game or sell it is because it occupies the same space as another of my all-time favorite games, which is War of the Ring. Just like War of the Ring, Star Wars Rebellion is a massive, complicated, long, heavily narrative-driven two-player game. Because it's such a long and complex game, it's not one that's going to get to the table very often, so when I do have the time and the willing opponent for a game like that, more often than not I would turn to War of the Ring. However, given that at their young age my kids are already getting into the whole Star Wars story, I think it's maybe a game I'm going to hang on to for now, both to play with a friend or two that are into the Star Wars universe and to save to maybe play with them in the future. It also shares with War of the Ring and with the previous games I was talking about the whole asymmetrical play idea where both players are playing very different games and are trying to achieve very different objectives. One cool thing about the game is how it incorporates the secrecy where the Imperial side is trying to hunt out and destroy the Rebel base, but they don't know where it is. I find the game can be a bit of a slog playing as the Imperial side as you're just kind of going from one planet to the next trying to figure out where this base is. And it's a little bit more nerve-wracking playing as the Rebels, trying to keep the base hidden, feeling like the Imperial side is always one step away from finding it. So I would say that it's probably more fun to play as the Rebels, but overall it's a game that I enjoy enough to hang on to it for now at least. And from sci-fi space epics, we're now going to go to a cyberpunk theme with Spectre Ops, a game by Emerson Matsuuchi and published by Plaid Hat Games. This is a game very much in the same vein as games like Scotland Yard and Fury of Dracula, where one player is making secret movements on the board, the other player or players are attempting to find and defeat that player who's moving around trying to complete objectives. Because of my love of Scotland Yard as a child, I have a real affinity for these types of games, and I've tried quite a number of them. Of all these one versus many games with the hidden movement, Spectre Ops is my favorite of the bunch because it takes the concepts of a highly complex version of the game like Fury of Dracula and distills it down to all the most fun, most exciting parts of the game and makes it a much quicker and more exciting play experience. Now, I don't like the theme at all, and I find the artwork weird and kind of uninteresting for me, and I wonder if that's partly why my wife wasn't enthralled with this game, unfortunately. It has such great minis and great production value that I feel like it could have been a really awesome game if they had used a theme that interested me more, but plenty of people seem to enjoy it, so who am I to say? Now, there is another game of this type coming out any day now called Hunt for the Ring that's in the Lord of the Rings universe that theme-wise could be much more up our alley, and it looks to be a very interesting game in this genre. So I'm going to have to check that out too. That being said, there is another standalone expansion for Spectre Ops that is also being released in the near future, so it'll be interesting to see how they take that system and add more interesting elements to it. So I'm definitely hanging on to Spectre Ops in the meantime. And thankfully one of my primary gaming partners does enjoy playing this particular game. Alright, if we're talking epic games, I gotta look at Tiny Epic Galaxies by Scott Almes and produced by Gamelin Games. This is part of a whole line of tiny epic games of various themes and types. And frankly, none of the other Tiny Epic games really grabbed me, but I kept hearing great things about Tiny Epic Galaxies. So I picked it up, and sure enough, I found it to be a really fun little game. It's amazing how it captures that epic space empire building game in a super fast play experience based around Yahtzee-style dice throwing. Of all the games that are built around that Yahtzee-style dice rolling structure, Tiny Epic Galaxies is my favorite one. And just when we were thinking that we had pretty much explored all that Tiny Epic Galaxies had to offer, along came the Into the Black expansion, which added a ton of new and interesting content. It's not one that you should dive into until you've played the base game a number of times so that you're familiar with it because of all the new things it adds. It certainly ratchets up the epic level of the game. I did post a playthrough of the solo rules for the base game, which I'll also link in the video description below. So we're going to dive deep next into Oceanos by Antoine Bauza and published by Yellow. It is also beautifully illustrated by Jérémy Fleury. Oceanos is a very simple and absolutely delightful game based around sort of a card drafting mechanism where you are exploring the depths of the ocean in your submarines. Just as in Tiny Epic Galaxies, it incorporates a very simple technological improvements mechanism, and it uses the game components in a wonderful way to visually illustrate the improvements to your submarine. In fact, I adore all the visuals of the game. The artwork is wonderful, the production of the components is fantastic, and I've heard it argued that the visuals of the game are what makes it a great game, but I also really enjoy the gameplay too. It's so simple yet leaves the players with so many tough decisions, and it's a fun experience overall. Now, if we're talking about fun, we got to talk about one of the biggest party game hits of recent years, and that is Codenames. It's by game designer Vlad Ashvatil, who is much more known for his highly complex games, so it was kind of surprising to see him create a very simple party game. But this is a fascinating team game where two players are trying to get their teams to guess their secret words amidst a pool of words that are out on the table. It's a mentally tough game for those clue givers. And rather than being a loud, uproarious party game, it's one of those kind of quiet, thinky types, but it leads to a lot of fun and funny moments at the same time. For groups of 4 or more players, Codenames is definitely a fun and interesting challenge. Okay, for Carcassonne fans, we now have Isle of Skye from Chieftain to King, designed by Alexander Pfister and Andreas Pelikan, and published by Mayfair Games. Isle of Skye is basically Carcassonne if you allow all the players to build their little own individual kingdom, and if you incorporate a really interesting economic system to the game. Now, I do admit there's a nostalgia factor for me because I do have relatives in Scotland, including in Portree on the Isle of Skye, and I've been there to visit them and I've taken a tour of Skye. So there's a lot of great memories associated for me there. But even with that all aside, it's still an extremely fun game to play. And the economic system really ratchets up this tile laying game to a really interesting and challenging level. Once again, it helps that the artwork is fantastic and it's a great looking game too. Okay, next we're delving into the dungeons with Clank, a deck building adventure by Paul Dennen and published by Renegade Games. Just as with the quest for El Dorado, Clank is built around the deck building mechanism. So players are trying to build a deck of cards that will most efficiently allow them to get into the dungeon, grab all the most valuable loot that they can, and then get out of there while making the least amount of noise or clank in order to not attract the attention of the dragon to them. So it's fascinating how this game is both a race game to get in, grab as much stuff as you can and get out, and also a push your luck game where the longer you spend within the dungeon and the more noise you make, the less likely it is that you'll survive the trip out of the dungeon again. We've gotten a ton of fun out of this game. And again, just as we were getting to the point where we felt like we had explored all it had to offer, along came the Sunken Treasures expansion, which added a second double-sided board for us to explore. So now with 2 double-sided boards, there's a lot of variety that we can have with our Clank adventures. Alright, before I get to my number 1, I gotta talk about a game that I don't have in front of me, and that's Pandemic Legacy Season 1. That is a game that provided us with some of the best game experiences we've ever had, and it's one of only 4 games that I rate 10 out of 10. If you like the original Pandemic board game, which is a fairly simple cooperative board game, you've got to check out Pandemic Legacy. It takes an already good game and adds this huge, interesting narrative to it where each gameplay you're uncovering and unlocking and discovering new things, and the game is morphing and changing as you play through it. I can't say enough great things about that particular game, and that's why we're so excited to be now diving into Season 2. Alright, last up, we've got the number 1 game, and this game not only has been the biggest hit from the past few years for us, this game, I would say, at least for me, has been the biggest hit of any game ever. In fact, I rank it as my number 1 game of all time. And if you've seen my video on it already, you will know that this 20-pound beast, Gloomhaven, by Isaac Childress and published by Cephalofair Games, is an absolute masterpiece of board game design. I won't say a ton about it because I have that other video I made about Gloomhaven, which I can again link below. But this takes that legacy style of game where you're discovering and unlocking new things as the narrative and the campaign progresses, and it takes it into the dungeon delving realms with lots of very interesting fantasy characters and monsters and quests and an interesting storyline to follow over time. We have dozens and dozens of hours of gameplay in this game already, and we're still loving it, still enamored by it, and I can't wait to see what we discover next. So there you have some of our recent biggest hits in board gaming. There are some upcoming titles that I'm really excited to see when they come out, and there's always new stuff to explore and enjoy. Thanks for watching. Hi, it's Josh here, just wanting to thank you for watching my video. If you want to support what I'm doing, it'd be awesome if you give me a like, a subscribe, and if you share this video with one other gamer in your life. Cheers. And obviously I need to, so I'll somewhat arbitrarily say that the game has to have been published in the past 3 years, 2016. Before I dive into this, however, as they progress through the game, they're going to have to balance spending their resources. However, and the final game in my honorable mentions is Risk Legacy. No. It's not. I'm going to show these games. Alright, let's dive into the actual list now. Although all of these have been a big hit with us, I'm going to say that, oh, for gosh sake, man. This is a card-based engine building game where you start with a little What do you start with? Villages of Valyria by Next up is a game that I verily This is a game very much in the tradition of games like Scotland Yard or Fury of Dracula. This is a game very much in the What did I just say? Of all the games that use that of all the games that use that dice style mechanism, dice rolling. Of all the games that use that style of dice rolling, of all the games that incorporate that style of dice rolling, of all the games that are built around that style of dice rolling, that technological improvements, is that what I want to say? It's by a game designer named Vladoch Chvátil. It's by game designer Vladoch Chvátil. Just as with the previously discussed. Alright, before I get to my number 1, I got to talk about my number 2, obviously. Economic system.